Welcome to His Eternal Diary. I was going through this script looking for the turning point, the confrontation, the moment everything erupts. It wasn't there. What I found instead was a man, 3 months before the worst night of his life, quietly removing his name from a set of documents. That single move is what separates this story from every other one like it.
I will tell you this the way it actually happened, not the way I wished it had. There was no single moment where I understood all of it. Understanding came in pieces, the way damage accumulates in a structure long before anything visibly cracks. By the time I could see the full shape of what had happened, I had already been living inside it for 5 years. Her name was Vesper. And before her name is anything else, let me be precise about what I mean by 5 years. I don't mean 5 years of a relationship. I mean 5 years of a question I asked once and never got a real answer to. 5 years of proximity, of usefulness, of being the man she turned to when the work was difficult and the clock was close. 5 years of being adjacent to a yes that was always one conversation away. It came. The yes. She gave it to a different man, just in front of 300 people in the second week of December, and when it came, I was ready for it in a way she hadn't expected. This is the story of how I got ready. I met her on a Tuesday in October in the basement conference room of a building on Aldercroft Street that smelled like damp ceiling tiles and vending machine coffee. I was 26. She was 25. We were both freelance consultants brought in to pitch to the same mid-size architecture firm that had decided it needed a brand overhaul it probably couldn't afford. I did software systems. She did marketing and narrative positioning. We had arrived with 30 minutes between our scheduled presentations, which meant we were briefly in the same room. She had spread her materials across half of my allotted table space without acknowledging it. Meh. When I moved my folder to make room for my laptop, she glanced up and said, "You're very tidy," with a kind of half-smile that was observing me rather than complimenting me, as if she had identified a characteristic and filed it. I said something forgettable. She smiled again, smaller this time, as if she had gotten the information she needed, and looked back at her notes. We both lost the pitch. The architecture firm went with an in-house solution that collapsed 4 months later. We found this out because we ran into each other at a coffee shop in the same neighborhood. A coincidence. Then it happened again 3 days later, and then a week after that. Each time, we exchanged a few words. Each time, the conversation lasted slightly longer than before. By the 4th meeting, once we had acknowledged that we lived within 4 blocks of each other and had overlapping schedules, and probably should stop pretending it was coincidental, I should mark that moment more carefully. The decision to stop pretending. Because that is where the 5 years actually start. The coffee shop was on Aldercroft Lane, around the corner from the building where we'd met. It was called Something Forgettable, a place with chipped mugs and mismatched chairs, and an espresso machine that made a grinding exhalation, like a long-held breath released every time it produced a shot. Vesper always sat in the corner facing the door. I noticed that she noticed me noticing. On our 3rd meeting there, she said, without looking up from whatever she was reading, "I like to see who's coming in." I asked her why. She said, "Because then nothing surprises me." I filed that. I filed a lot of things she said, for a long time, under the wrong category. We were not yet friends, not exactly. We were 2 people who had the same morning routine and had stopped pretending that was coincidental. She talked about her work with a specificity I respected. Names of clients, specific problems, the particular texture of what wasn't working, and what she intended to do about it. She had ideas that arrived fully formed, which is rarer than most people think. And she listened when I explained how systems worked, not with polite interest, but with the look of someone who was already calculating how to use the information. I found that attractive. I should have found it informative. No, there is a kind of person who receives everything you offer with evident appreciation and converts it into forward motion for themselves. I do not say this as a criticism. It is a skill. Genuinely. She had it. She could take a conversation, an idea, a technical explanation, a personal observation, and assimilate it so efficiently that within a week it would appear in something she was building. What she was building, steadily, was a version of herself that could operate at a significant professional level. I was useful to that project, and she knew it, and I did not mind being useful, because being useful kept me in the room. By December, I had given her my number. By January, we had had dinner that was not a date, but felt like a rehearsal for one. By February, I was the person she called when a client email unsettled her, which happened often because she was building something, and building things is unsettling. She was starting a consultancy, marketing and narrative positioning for mid-size professional services firms. It was a good idea. She had the instinct for it. What she didn't have yet was the operational foundation. I had it. I want to be honest about this part, because it's easy to misremember it as exploitation. She didn't ask me to build her anything in the beginning. I offered. She was describing a client management problem over coffee one Saturday morning in March, trying to track communications across multiple accounts. Manually, in a spreadsheet that had grown into something she was afraid to scroll to the bottom of. She said it with resigned humor. The way you describe a problem you've been living with too long to be properly frustrated by. I said I could build her something cleaner, a lightweight CRM with her workflow built in. 2 weekends, I told her. It took 4. She brought me coffee the second weekend. Takeout containers the third. She sat across from me at her kitchen table reading while I worked, not talking, not watching, just present, as if the work was something we were doing together, even though she was reading a novel. I remember the particular quiet of those afternoons. Her apartment had good light, west-facing, and by 4 o'clock in autumn, it filled the room with something orange and warm. The sound of her pages turning, the smell of whatever she'd ordered, something with garlic and lemon, a place nearby she ordered from often. As occasionally she would look up and say something small, a question about a client she was worried about. I would answer without looking up from the code. She would say, "Good," and go back to reading. I understood much later that she was very good at creating the feeling of intimacy without creating the conditions for it. What I understood at the time was that I wanted to be in that kitchen again. So I kept finding reasons. I told myself the reasons were professional. The system needed refinements. She had asked about a new module. There was a bug in the scheduling component. All of this was true. None of it was the actual reason. The actual reason was the light at 4 o'clock, and the sound of her reading, and the feeling of working alongside someone who trusted you with something that mattered to them. I was building her business. I thought I was building something else. The system I built worked, better than I had estimated. Within 6 months, she had organized her entire client pipeline through it, added a scheduling module I hadn't planned for, and started mentioning it to 2 other consultants she knew. She asked me once about licensing it, making it more broadly available, with a revenue share. I told her to wait until it was more developed. She nodded and moved on. This was a habit of hers. She would propose something, receive a response, and file the response without apparent frustration. She was not deterred by a not yet. She simply reclassified it as later. She had a way of receiving things, information, offers, help, that made you feel as though you had given her exactly what she needed. Not gratitude exactly, more like alignment. Yet you had solved something she already knew was solvable, and she was confirming that you had gotten it right. The confirmation itself was the reward. It made you want to solve the next thing. I solved several next things over the course of that year. A client proposal template system that reduced her quoting time from 3 hours to 40 minutes. An automated reporting module that generated her monthly client updates with minimal manual input. A client portal with her branding built in that gave her an appearance of organizational scale she didn't yet have. I did not bill her for any of it. This was, I told myself, because we were friends and the work was enjoyable, and I was building towards something more significant than an invoice. The something more significant was, I believed, a conversation about us, and about what we were to each other and what we might become. It never quite arrived. Every time the conversation might have moved in that direction, something intervened. A client deadline, a difficult week, a moment where the mood had shifted from potential to practical, and I had let it shift because I was afraid of the practical answer. I was 26, then 27, telling myself there was time. There was always time. The next conversation would be the right one. Gideon asked me once, during what must have been year 2, a pub night in November, with low ceilings and worn floors and 2 pints each, what exactly was happening between me and Vesper? Gideon and I had known each other since we were teenagers. He had known me long enough to have calibrated exactly when I was telling myself a convenient version of something. He said, "Have you told her how you feel?" I said it was more complicated than that. He said, "Is it complicated, or is it that you don't know what she'll say?" I didn't answer, which was its own answer. He said, "From where I'm sitting, you're building this woman's business and hoping she figures it out. That's not a strategy. That's a prayer." I said something defensive. He let me finish, took a drink, and said, "I'm not criticizing. I'm just naming what's happening." I thought about that for weeks afterward. I told myself he was wrong. What Vesper and I had was its own kind of intimacy, something that didn't require forcing into a formal conversation. The right moment would arrive naturally. The right moment was a category I expanded to include almost every moment for 5 years. Year 2 had a texture I remember as warm and exhausting. She had her first significant client, a regional law firm that paid real money and needed her full attention for 3 months. I helped her build the deliverable framework for it, a client reporting dashboard, an automated update system that made her look more organized than any 2-person consultancy reasonably should. The visual design was hers. The architecture was mine. She presented the firm's brand repositioning at a dinner I was not invited to. She called me afterward from a taxi, voice slightly elevated with the controlled excitement that means something has gone very well, and said, "It worked." I said, "I know." She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that carries real relief underneath it. She said, "I couldn't have done it without the dashboard." I said, "You could have. It would have taken longer." She said, "You always do that." I asked what I was doing. She said, "Give the credit back." A pause. "Don't do that." I didn't know what to say. I said something modest. She said her taxi had arrived somewhere, and she said goodnight with a warmth in her voice I stored carefully and retrieved often. I sat in the silence after that call for a long time. Not thinking, exactly. Just filing it in the wrong category again. Year 3 arrived with a colder energy. She began mentioning other men. Not frequently, not pointedly, just the way a person slips a fact into a conversation. Naturally, as though it isn't significant. A client dinner she'd been to, a colleague she'd been working with, a man she'd met at an industry event who had interesting ideas about positioning. She didn't name Conrad yet. That came later. What she did, in year 3, it was create a light ambiguity. A soft atmospheric signal that the space I had been occupying was not exclusive. I understood this only after the fact. At the time, I felt a low, cold pressure in my chest when she mentioned other men, and I interpreted that pressure as jealousy, which is the simpler name for a more complicated signal. The complicated signal was, she knows what I feel. She is managing it. She is keeping the question open so the answer doesn't have to be given. I chose not to name this. The naming would have required me to act, and acting required a willingness to receive an answer I wasn't ready for. So I kept the pressure filed under jealousy, which was manageable, rather than under information, which would have required a response. What I was really doing was believing that if I became indispensable enough, the question would answer itself. I told her in year 3, not dramatically, not the way you see in films. We were in her office. She had an office now, a one-room space on the 3rd floor of a converted building that smelled like fresh paint and the particular dry heat of a radiator running too long. And I had just helped her through a contract negotiation with a difficult client. The client had been trying to redefine the project scope after she had begun the work. A standard tactic: start the engagement, then expand the deliverables without adjusting the fee. I had read her original contract carefully, marked the specific clauses, and drafted her response. The email I helped her write was precise and pleasant, and gave the client exactly one path: the original scope for a properly compensated expansion, whilst the client backed down within 24 hours. She looked at the confirmation email on her screen and said, "You're too good at this." I said, "Vesper, I need to tell you something." She looked at me, not startled. There was something in her expression that I recognized, only later, as a door she had decided to open because she had prepared for what would be on the other side of it. She had been waiting for this. She had her response ready, I told her. Not a speech. Specifically, that what I felt for her wasn't friendly, that it hadn't been for a long time, that I wasn't asking for anything to change immediately. But I wanted her to know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." I waited. She said, "I've thought about it too." A pause. "I'm not in a place where I can give you an answer right now. There's a lot happening with the business, and I don't want to rush something and get it wrong." I said I understood. She said, "I don't want to lose what we have." I said I didn't either. She reached across the desk and touched my hand briefly, a gesture that was warm and conclusive at the same time, like a sentence that ends in a period. Warm enough to be reassuring. Final enough to close the conversation. I walked out of her office and stood in the street for a while. The air was cold. A bus went past. I stood there and told myself, she needs time. I'll give her time. This was honest. It was also exactly what she needed me to do. I gave her 2 more years. I want to explain what those 2 years looked like, because the description matters for everything that comes after. She was growing. Genuinely. The consultancy went from a 1-woman operation to 4 full-time staff by the end of year 4. She had clients in 3 sectors: legal, financial advisory, and a cluster of architecture and design firms she had cultivated carefully. She had been asked to speak at 2 industry events. A trade publication ran a profile on her with a photograph I thought was very good. She was good at what she did. I want that to be clear. The quality of her work was real, the strategy was hers, the relationships were hers. What she had built on the foundation I provided was genuinely valuable, because she was the kind of person who could build something valuable if the ground was solid enough. I had provided very solid ground. During those 2 years, I expanded the system significantly. A second developer had joined her team. I worked with him to extend the architecture I had built, handing off documentation, answering questions, spending occasional weekends debugging a module that had grown in directions I hadn't planned for. I was not being paid for any of this. I told myself it was transitional, that once we had had the real conversation, the one I believed was still coming, the question of compensation would become irrelevant in a different way. I was 29, then 30. Still telling myself this. In year 4, I had a consultancy of my own that had grown significantly. Systems consulting for mid-size financial services firms. The work was well paid and largely invisible, which suited me. I had moved into a better apartment I saved carefully. But I had the kind of financial position that is quiet and solid, not visible, but present, like good construction. I want to mention my financial position not to establish credentials, but because it's relevant to what comes later. Specifically, I was not doing Vesper's technical work out of financial desperation. I was doing it because I had, at some point, stopped counting. That is a more honest version of what happened than the version where I'm a victim of exploitation. I was a man who had decided that the accumulation of contribution was itself a form of declaration, that the more I gave, the more clearly the relationship would reveal itself as what I hoped it was. What I had not calculated was that accumulation without declaration reads as a permanent state of affairs, not a gesture toward something, just how things are. I had become, structurally, a permanent feature of her business. Reliable, available, undocumented, like the wiring in the walls. I first heard Conrad's name in the spring of year 4. She mentioned him the way she'd mentioned others. Casually, in the middle of a conversation about something else. A dinner she'd been to. A connection through a financial services client. A man who worked in private equity, older than us by about a decade, who had a particular kind of social capital. He knew people who knew people, and the introductions he made tended to open rooms. I noted the name, filed it under Vesper's professional network, went back to whatever we were discussing. I heard it again 2 weeks later, and again 3 weeks after that. By summer, Conrad was appearing in her stories the way a recurring character appears in a series before the writers acknowledge they've made him central. He was always at the edges. A dinner she had mentioned. An event they had both attended. A recommendation he had passed along that had led somewhere useful. The frequency wasn't what unsettled me. It was the register. When she mentioned professional contacts, she described them in terms of what they had offered or what they represented, the kind of shorthand that separates a person from their function. When she mentioned Conrad, there was a slight pause in the language, a moment where the shorthand didn't quite fit, as if the category he occupied was still being determined. I asked about him once, in August, carefully, as if the question were simply informational. She said, "Oh, he's very well connected. He's introduced me to 2 potential clients this year." I asked if she knew him well. She said, without quite looking at me, "We've been seeing each other occasionally." There it was. The sentence I had been circling. Said plainly to my face, with the particular composure of someone who has chosen a moment carefully and has decided this is it. I said, "Okay." She said, "It's not serious." I said, "You don't have to explain anything to me." She said, "Callum." The whole grammar of my name in 2 syllables, a warning, a softening, an acknowledgement, all at once, I said, "I mean it." We changed the subject. I drove home at exactly the speed limit. "It's not serious" is a sentence that carries a particular weight. It can mean, "This is new, and I don't know what it is yet." It can mean, "I know you're watching, and this is what I'm giving you to hold." It can mean, "I have decided this is the moment I begin to close the distance between us, gently enough that you won't have to call it what it is." I didn't know which of these it was during the drive home. What I did know, by the time I parked and sat in the dark of my building's underground garage, was that I was tired. Not angry. Not heartbroken. Tired, specifically, in the way you get tired when you realize you've been doing something for a long time and the result has not materialized. I went upstairs. I poured water. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet. And then, because I am the kind of person I am, I started making a list. Not a list of grievances, a list of facts. What I had contributed to her business over 4 years. In time, in intellectual labor, in material. At the systems I had built and never invoiced. The hours spent maintaining them. The contract negotiations I had guided. The client crises I had managed at midnight. The developer I had onboarded and trained on an architecture I had created. The financial referrals that had come from my own professional network. The 2 industry contacts I had introduced her to without making it an event, so she would not feel obligated. I was not angry as I made this list. Anger would have been warmer. What I felt was the particular chill of clarity after a long time in a warm room. The items accumulated. I opened my laptop. I started trying to attach rough figures. The CRM I had originally built represented, at market rate for custom-built client management with the features I had included, somewhere between $18,000 and $25,000 of professional labor. The portal, the reporting system, the proposal templates, the onboarding documentation for her developer. When I totaled these at a conservative professional rate, the number was significant. And then, I noticed something more important than the number. All of this work was either undocumented or documented in a way that attributed it entirely to her. The CRM was registered in her business name. The client portal carried her company branding in its metadata because I had set it up that way at the beginning and had never changed it. The code I had handed off was unmarked by my name or my terms because at the time I had thought of this as generosity. I was giving her something clean, unmarked by the conditions under which it was given. What it meant, legally, was that I had no demonstrable claim to any of it. If Vesper and I were simply 2 professionals who had occasionally collaborated, I was a volunteer who had built and donated the operational backbone of someone else's business. I thought about this for 3 days. I turned it over. I looked at it from different angles. Then I called Elena. Elena was a contracts and IP attorney I had worked with on several of my own client projects. She was direct and meticulous, with a habit of identifying the worst-case scenario within the first 5 minutes of any conversation and describing it without apparent distress. She had once told me, over a client dispute of mine, that the most expensive mistake a consultant makes is under-documenting their contributions to joint work. She had been describing, without knowing it, exactly what I had spent 4 years doing. I went to her office on a Thursday afternoon in September. The light was low and thin, the kind of autumn day that runs out of energy before 4 o'clock. Her office smelled like printer toner and the faint sweetness of the orchid she kept on the windowsill, which had always seemed wrong for a contracts attorney, but which I had stopped remarking on years ago. I laid out the situation without editorializing. Here is what I built. Here is how it's currently titled. Here is the nature of the relationship. Here is what I want to establish now. Elena listened without interrupting. She had a way of listening that was very still. No nodding, no sounds of agreement, just absorption, a focus that was slightly unnerving if you didn't know her. When I finished, she said, "How much of this is documented anywhere, in your name?" I told her very little. She said, "Does she know you're here?" I said she did not. Elena nodded. Functionally, not sympathetically. She said, "All right, here's what we're going to do." What Elena outlined was methodical and completely legal. The first step was documentation. I needed to establish with timestamps what I had contributed and when. Code repositories, version histories, email chains showing work in progress, anything that carried a date and my name. I had more of this than I initially thought. My development environment kept local version histories going back to the beginning. My email archive contained 4 years of threads, me describing features, debugging, handing off completed modules, plus message logs where Vesper asked me to fix something, and I confirmed it was done. Elena said, "This is a paper trail. It's incomplete, but it's real." What I didn't have was any written agreement. No contract, no letter of engagement, no scope document of any kind. Elena said, "Which means right now you're effectively a volunteer who built her a house, and the house is in her name, and there's no evidence suggesting otherwise except a very thorough email archive." She paused. "There are a few directions we can go." She turned her laptop toward me and pulled up 2 document templates. The first was a retroactive contribution agreement, a document that, when signed, would formally establish the history of what I had contributed and under what terms. And it would classify the work as professional services rendered under a deferred compensation arrangement, not as a gift or a voluntary contribution. It would be supported by the archived evidence we had inventoried. Elena said, "This doesn't require her to pay you anything retroactively. What it does is create a documented record of what happened, a factual baseline. If it's ever relevant for any reason, that record exists and is signed by both parties." The second document was an IP licensing and transfer offer, structured as a formal professional proposal. Here are the assets I created. Here are their documented functions. Here is a transfer price for full ownership. Elena said the price should be set below market. Not significantly below enough to be clearly fair, not so far below as to seem like a gesture, a number that any third-party professional would look at and call reasonable. I asked what happened if she refused to sign either. Elena said, "The attempt becomes part of the record. The email sending the documents is time-stamped. The documentation attached to it is time-stamped. If she declines, the fact that you offered a formalized arrangement and she declined is itself information." I said, "I'm not planning litigation." Elena said, "I know, but information is useful whether or not litigation is the plan." We spent 90 minutes building the documentation package. I would need 2 more meetings with Elena, and several evenings going through my archive carefully before everything was complete. The process was detailed and occasionally tedious and completely necessary. But I left her office as the sun was finishing its exit behind the buildings across the street, and the city below was filling with the early evening light that comes up from nowhere on October evenings, orange and slightly wrong. I felt, walking to my car, the particular sensation of having started something. The second step was more technical. The systems I had built for Vesper were still running, in significant part, on server accounts I personally controlled. This had happened the way these things happen with early-stage technical work. When I had originally built the CRM and portal, I had used my own service credentials because I was the one maintaining everything, and it was simpler. I had set up the hosting, the API keys, the deployment pipelines, all under accounts tied to my own professional identity. I had intended, at the time, to migrate everything to her own accounts once the systems stabilized. The systems had stabilized. I had never migrated. Not deliberately. The migration simply never became urgent because I was always present, always available, always the person who knew how everything connected. There was no external pressure to formalize ownership because I had never left. What this meant was that the entire operational backbone of her consultancy, the CRM, the client portal, the reporting layer, the API integrations with her scheduling and billing tools, was running inside an environment I still controlled and had continued to maintain. I had not mentioned this to Vesper because it had never seemed significant. It was, I now recognized, extremely significant. Elena noted this immediately when I described it during our second meeting. She said, "Was with the equanimity she brings to everything, you need to inventory that very carefully. And then you need to decide what you want to do with it." I told her what I wanted to do with it. She said, "Good, write that down." Over the following 3 weeks, I documented every server dependency, every API key, every integration point in the systems I controlled. I built a complete technical inventory of what her business ran on, layer by layer. I did this quietly, from my own systems, without touching hers. The scope was larger than I had consciously registered. It was not just the original CRM and portal. Over 4 years of incremental work, I had extended the architecture so that it connected to her billing system, her project management tool, her automated invoicing, and a client communication layer that her developer had built on top of my original framework. All of these integrations ran through access credentials I still held. If I removed myself without transition, the operational disruption would be significant. I was not going to do that. I was not building a weapon. I was building a record. What I intended to do, what I told Elena I intended to do, was offer a complete, professionally documented transfer. A clean exit. Everything her business needed, handed over properly, at a fair price, with a defined support period to ensure her team could maintain it independently. The offer would be reasonable, it would be documented, and it would be made at a time of my choosing. The time I was choosing was after the question I had been waiting 5 years to answer had finally answered itself. Thus, not in retaliation, in completion. September moved like something underwater. Vesper and I still saw each other, 2 or 3 times that month, a dinner, a work overlap, an evening where she asked me to review a new client proposal, and I did. Conrad's name appeared in conversation with increasing regularity. The register in which she mentioned him had shifted. The ambiguity was gone. There was something settled in it now. A quality of finality, though she had said nothing definitive. I did not push. I had stopped waiting for the right moment. I was, quietly, preparing for the exit. In October, Gideon came to see me. He arrived at my apartment on a Friday evening without calling ahead, which he never did, which told me something immediately. He had brought beer he knew I didn't drink, which told me more. And he sat down on my couch and looked at me with the expression he reserves for conversations he has prepared for. He said, "Have you met Conrad?" I said no. He said, "I have." He let that land. Then he said, "He was at the Aldercroft Industry dinner last month. I went with a client." He paused. "He asked about you." I said, "Why would he ask about me?" Gideon said, "Because apparently Vesper mentions you. Regularly." He looked at the beer bottle he was turning in his hands. He was pleasant about it, confident. The way someone is when they've already decided how the story ends, and they've decided to be generous about the other characters. I looked at him. He said, "She's going to say yes, if he asks." Another pause. "And I think he's going to ask soon. Maybe before the end of the year." I asked him why he thought that. He said, "Because I had a 40-minute conversation with him, and he referred to her apartment as our apartment twice in passing, and then caught himself and didn't correct it the second time. The apartment he described as theirs was the apartment I had driven her to view 6 times before she signed the lease. The apartment I had been in 2 or 3 times a week for 3 years. The apartment where she had sat across from me on Saturday afternoons while I worked, reading, with the autumn light doing its 4 o'clock thing across the floor." Gideon said, "I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because I think you've been waiting for something, and I think you already know it's not coming, and I think it would be better for you to hear it plainly from me than to find out in a room full of people." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I've been working on it." He looked at me differently then, less worried, more curious. "What have you been working on?" I told him. Not every detail, but enough. Elena, the documentation, the technical inventory, the plan for a formal handoff. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "That's not what I expected you to say." I asked what he'd expected. He said, "Something more emotional." I said, "This is more useful." He stayed for another hour. We didn't talk about Vesper again. He left the beer he'd brought in my refrigerator, and I let it stay there, because it felt like a marker. I called Elena the following morning and told her to finalize both documents. She had them ready within 10 days. The contribution agreement and the IP licensing and transfer offer, and each with a full supporting package, the technical inventory, the time-stamped version histories, the email archive excerpts establishing the scope and timeline of my work. Every attachment cross-referenced and dated. The transfer price was set at what Elena described as demonstrably fair. Below market for custom systems of equivalent complexity, but not so far below as to be notable. A number that reflected professional courtesy rather than anything else. I spent 2 evenings reviewing every line. I changed 3 things and left the rest. I sent both documents to Vesper by registered email on a Wednesday morning in November. The email I wrote was 3 sentences. I said, "I've been thinking about formalizing our working arrangement. Attached are 2 documents, one establishing the contributions I've made over the last 4 years, and one offering you a formal transfer of those assets at below market rate. I think it's the right professional move, regardless of everything else." I did not use the word relationship. I did not reference any conversation we had ever had. I pressed send and went for a 2-hour walk in the cold November air and came back and found her reply waiting. She had replied in 58 minutes. The email said, "Callum, I didn't expect this. I didn't think we needed to formalize things between us. Can we talk?" I wrote back, "Of course. Let me know when you're free." She called that evening. The conversation was careful on both sides. She asked if something had changed. I said I was being more professional about undocumented work arrangements generally. She asked if I was angry about something. I said no. And it was true. Anger had been one option, and I had found a more useful one. She said the documents felt formal. I said that was the point of documents. She asked, "Are you doing this because of Conrad?" I said, "Conrad isn't a factor. I'm doing this because it's the right professional move for both of us." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to have my lawyer look at these." I said, "That's completely reasonable." She said, "Callum." The full grammar of my name again, the two-syllable sentence. I said, "Vesper, it's just business. Sign if you think it's fair. Don't sign if you don't." She said she'd be in touch. Her lawyer looked at the documents. I know this because, through a mutual professional contact who handled some overlap in our networks, and I learned that her attorney had told her the contribution agreement was factually accurate based on the supporting documentation, and that the transfer offer was priced generously below the operational value of the systems it covered. He advised her to sign. She signed both documents in the third week of November. Registered return receipt. Elena confirmed the receipt and filed everything correctly. With her signatures, Vesper had formally acknowledged that the systems running her business had been built by me under a deferred compensation arrangement, and that she had now purchased full IP and operational transfer rights for the documented price. The timestamps were clean. The documentation was complete. I had given 5 years of work a legal record, and the clock had started. I should explain what I mean by the clock. The transfer agreement included a standard transition clause, a 90-day support and handoff period during which I would provide technical continuity while her team built independent operational capacity. After 90 days, my obligations ended completely. Any continued engagement would require a separately negotiated contract. In plain terms, 90 days, and I was done. Vesper understood this in a general sense, I believe. The clause was in the document. Her lawyer had presumably read it. But I think she processed the documents primarily as professional housekeeping, the kind of paperwork that formalizes an existing arrangement without fundamentally changing it. She had not, I think, fully absorbed what the transition clause meant operationally, that the man who had been available to her business for 4 years was, as of the document date, available for 90 more days only. The transfer of systems had already begun. I had started the migration 2 weeks before sending the documents, not because I was rushing to remove myself, but because I wanted the technical reality to match the legal reality from the moment the signatures landed. No gap, no ambiguity. By the day she signed, I had transferred 30% of the operational systems. The transfer continued in stages through November. First, the code repositories, handed to her developer with full documentation, every version, every commit history, every commented line explained. Second, the server credentials, migrated to her company's own service accounts, one system at a time, with a migration log I kept in real time. Third, the API integrations, each one reconfigured to run under her credentials rather than mine. I did this calmly, without ceremony. It was technical work, clean and methodical. I had done more complex migrations in a weekend for financial clients who compensated me properly. Her developer was competent. He asked good questions. He was building familiarity with a system he had only partially understood before this, and the process of learning it was making clear to him. I could see it in the specificity of his questions shifting in week 3. Exactly how much of the business had been running on something he had not built and did not yet fully understand. He was professional about it. He never said anything direct. But the questions moved, week by week, from "where is this?" to "how much of this is structured this way?" The answer was more than you thought. I answered everything. That was in the agreement. By the 5th week, 60% was transferred. The Aldercroft Foundation's annual dinner was the 2nd Friday of December. It was a significant event in the professional services sector. Black tie, 300 people, The kind of room where certain announcements found a natural audience. Vesper had attended the previous 2 years. She mentioned this year's dinner in passing in late November, saying she was going. She said it with a quality of anticipation that was different from previous years. I had received my own invitation through a financial services client who sat on the Foundation's advisory board. I had attended the last 3 years. I said nothing to Vesper about attending. I knew Conrad would be there. Gideon had confirmed it when I mentioned the dinner casually. He said, "Conrad goes every year. It's that kind of event for him." That kind of event. The kind where things happen in front of the right people. I arrived early enough to know the room before it filled. I found my table, spoke to the people I knew, moved in the professional current of those evenings. I was genuinely present. I had a client at 2 tables over whose renewal I was tracking, and several useful conversations to have. I saw her when she came in. She was wearing something dark and close-fitting, and her hair was differently arranged than I had ever seen, and she came through the entrance with Conrad. He was taller than I had imagined from Gideon's description. Broad through the shoulders, yet with the ease of a man who has never once been uncertain about whether he belonged in a room. He put his hand briefly on the small of her back as they moved through the entrance crowd, and she didn't adjust away from it. She moved into it by half a degree, the lean that is almost invisible. I turned back to my table. The man beside me was making a point about regulatory timelines. I listened to the point. I made a useful observation. We moved on. I did not look in their direction again for approximately 2 hours. Dinner itself passed the way those evenings do. Speeches, a program, courses brought to tables with the mechanical precision of an event that has been run many times. The food was good. The wine was appropriate. The speeches ran slightly longer than they needed to, which is constant. I ate and spoke and was present. I was seated next to a woman who ran a mid-size accounting practice and had interesting things to say about the regulatory environment. Across from me, a fund manager I had met once previously who had a dry humor I had liked. The conversation moved well. After the speeches, after dessert, after the formal program ended and the room shifted into its secondary phase, the open floor, the movement between tables, the smaller conversations that were often the real reason for attending, I stood and refilled my glass and let myself absorb the room. I had not been looking for them, but the room is not large enough, with 300 people in it, to avoid noticing entirely. They were at a table on the far side, standing now, in a small cluster of people. Conrad was talking, and she was listening with her body angled toward him in the way people stand when they are not thinking about how they are standing. I watched for about 4 seconds and looked elsewhere. The room changed pitch at around 9:45. Not loudly. These rooms don't change loudly. It was a collective readjustment of attention, the way a room of people simultaneously becomes aware that something is happening in a specific location. I have been in enough of these rooms to recognize it as a feeling before it becomes a visual. I turned. Conrad was standing near the center of the room, in a space that had cleared around him slightly. Not a staged clearing, just the natural drift of people when something is in progress. He was speaking to Vesper, his voice low enough that I couldn't hear it from where I stood. She was looking at him with an expression I had never seen directed at me in 5 years. Then he reached into his jacket. The gesture was brief and contained, but the room had already begun to orient. Small box. Dark velvet. The cluster that had been 6 or 7 people became 12, then 15, in the way these moments accumulate their witnesses. I watched him open it. I watched him say what he said. I couldn't hear the words, but I know the form of them. She said yes before he had finished. She said it quickly, the way you say something when you have known the answer before the question was completed. There was sound in it. Not a shout, not a performance, just a single word carrying the full weight of certainty. And the sound carried across the room because rooms like that one are built with the acoustics of announcement. What 300 people heard her. The room applauded. Someone near me said, "How lovely." Someone else said something about the timing. I set my glass down on the nearest surface. I walked to the coat room at the same pace I had walked there previously, 2 hours before, when I had checked in on arrival. I gave the attendant my ticket. I collected my jacket. I walked out. The air outside was cold enough to see. December cold, the kind that clarifies. A car passed. Somewhere a block north, something was being loaded off a truck. The mechanical clanging of a lifting gate, measured and ordinary. I stood on the pavement for approximately 2 minutes. I was not performing composure. What happened inside me during those 2 minutes was something I don't have a precise word for except settling. Not collapse, not rage, settling. At the way sediment falls in water that has stopped moving, the slow resolution of something that has been suspended for a long time. I thought about 5 years, not in images, in a more structural way. The shape of them, what they had cost, in time and work, and the particular energy of sustained hope. What I had built during them, not for her, for myself. The practice, the financial position, the client network. The company I had incorporated 3 weeks earlier, which Elena had structured and filed cleanly, with every IP clause written correctly from the first document. The contribution agreement was signed. The documentation was complete. 60% of the systems were already transferred. I took out my phone and sent Elena a message. Transition timeline can accelerate. Let's adjust to 60 days remaining rather than 90. Or she replied within a few minutes. Understood. I'll update the documentation and notify her developer of the revised timeline. I put my phone in my pocket. I walked to where my car was parked and drove home at the speed limit, precisely. I want to be precise about what happened over the following weeks, because the mechanism matters. The transfer agreement I had signed with Vesper required technical continuity during the transition period. That obligation was real, and I honored it. What I did after the dinner was not disruption. It was not retaliation. It was simply completion. Faster. I had been at 60% when I sent Elena the message. I moved to 70% within the first week of December. 80% by the second week. I worked methodically, following the migration log I had built months earlier, and transferring each system in the order I had planned, with full documentation at every step. By December 23rd, the transition was 95% complete. Her developer received the final system handoff the first Tuesday of January. Every credential transferred. Every repository handed over with full version history. Every API integration reconfigured to run under her company's own accounts. The migration log attached to the final handoff email. Clean and complete. What he received was the full picture of everything he was now responsible for. He called Vesper that afternoon. Not in distress, in the tone of a competent person who has just understood the full scope of something he had been standing on without knowing its depth. She called me on a Wednesday evening in early January. I was cooking. The pan was hot. The apartment had the smell of garlic and onion at the beginning of something, which is a good smell. She said, "My developer says the transfer is complete." I said, "Yes," ahead of the adjusted schedule. A pause. Then, "He says the architecture is more complex than he realized. that he's going to need several months to fully understand it and stabilize it independently. I said, I know. I've given him complete documentation. It should cover everything he'll encounter. She said, he thinks it'll take 3 months before they're fully independent. I said, that sounds about right for a system this size. A longer pause. I kept cooking. The garlic was just beginning to move in the oil. She said, Callum. Anne said, Vesper. She said, is this because of what happened at the Aldercroft dinner? I said, I transferred the systems according to the agreement you signed in November. The transition is complete and fully documented. Everything your business runs on is now entirely yours. A pause. That's what we agreed to. She said, but you're just done. You're actually done. I said, the agreement had a defined end, yes. A silence. In the silence, I heard something that might have been her composing herself, or might have been just the particular quality of a phone line held in a quiet room. She said, I thought you would always be... She stopped. I waited. She said, I thought you'd still be around. Somehow. I said, you've got a good team. Your developer is capable. She said, that's not what I mean. I said, I know what you mean. I moved the pan slightly off the heat. Good luck with everything. I mean that. I ended the call. I put the phone face down on the counter and stood in my kitchen for a moment in the quiet. There was something in that quiet I had not felt in a long time. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something more neutral than either. The particular quality of a thing completed, a door closed without a draft. I moved the pan back to the heat and finished cooking. I should describe what happened to her business in the following months, because this is the outcome of the mechanism, not a footnote. The systems were hers, completely, legally, cleanly. I had transferred everything with full documentation and professional courtesy. Her developer was genuinely competent. He stabilized the architecture. It took 4 months. During those 4 months, 2 clients experienced service disruptions resulting from the transition, delayed reporting cycles, and a client portal access issue that lasted 11 days before his team resolved it. Both clients were professionally understanding. The relationships held. One reduced their contract for the following cycle, citing administrative instability during the renewal conversation. The revenue impact was trackable. Elena had modeled it as a forecast risk during our transition documentation work. It landed in the middle of her projected range. The business survived. It had always been solid in itself. Vesper was genuinely skilled at what she did, and the client relationships she had built were real. But in those 4 months, she understood something she had not previously fully understood. Not just what I had built, yet what it had been worth while I was still building it and maintaining it and making myself available at midnight when something broke, and never once mentioning that the whole operation was running on my credentials. What it was worth to have that, without a contract, without a fee, without a formal acknowledgement. She understood the value of it when she no longer had it. Conrad and Vesper were married the following June. Gideon attended through a mutual connection and told me afterward with the economy of someone who knows less is more. June 14th, nice venue. She looked happy. I said, good. He said, you all right? I said, I've been all right since December. He considered this. He said, what are you doing instead? What I was doing instead was building something. I had taken on a significant systems contract in January, a full client management and reporting architecture for a financial services firm that had been looking for exactly what I built. The contract was for a figure I won't specify, but which moved me into a different category. The kind of category where the work speaks for itself in a very specific numerical language. I had incorporated my company in November, 2 weeks after sending Vesper the documents. The timing was not coincidental. The company was structured properly from the beginning. Elena drafted the IP ownership clauses. Every line of code I wrote from that point forward was registered correctly, owned explicitly, time-stamped. Contract terms were standard and professionally maintained. I invoiced on time and kept clear records. It is a remarkable thing, at the difference between building something for someone who may or may not acknowledge it, and building something that is yours, documented, from the first line to the final deployment. I had spent 5 years building the former. Everything I built after December was the latter. By June, when Vesper was getting married in a nice venue, I had 2 additional contracts in negotiation and a third still 6 months out that I had been quietly positioning toward. By autumn, the company had 3 full-time employees and a revenue profile that made my previous financial position look like a forecast rather than a ceiling. I did not build any of this to prove something to anyone. I built it because I had finally stopped building things for reasons other than the work itself. I ran into Vesper once more, in October, in a professional breakfast event, smaller than the Aldercroft dinner, a morning thing in a hotel conference room that smelled like buffet eggs and new carpet. I had nearly not gone. I rescheduled a client call to be there. She saw me first. She crossed the room with the particular composure of someone who has prepared for this encounter and decided to handle it well. She looked good, not changed, herself, in a new configuration. The ring was there. She had the manner of someone who has found the stable ground they'd been moving toward for a long time. She said, "Hi." I said, "Hi." She asked how I was doing. I said, "Well," and asked her the same. She said things were good. The business had stabilized. She had brought in a new technical lead. The team had expanded. She said it with genuine pride, which I recognized as real. She said, "I heard you incorporated." I said yes. She said, "That's good." She said it a second time, as if the first hadn't fully landed. "That's really good." There was something in it she needed to say, not congratulation exactly, more like an acknowledgement that had been waiting for its moment. A small silence opened between us. She said, "I'm sorry. About how things went, about the years." She looked at me steadily. "I don't think I was fair to you." I looked back at her. I thought about several things I could say. I chose none of them. I said, "Thank you for signing the documents." She blinked, not visibly hurt, more like the shape of my response hadn't fit the space she had prepared for it, like handing someone a receipt when they were expecting a different kind of conversation. Then she nodded. Of course." A mutual contact arrived and inserted himself into the conversation, and we moved into the professional register, the comfortable ambient gear of industry events. We spoke for another few minutes. Then I checked my phone and excused myself. I walked to the lobby and took the call, standing by the hotel doors, where the morning air came through each time someone entered. The call was with the client I had been positioning toward since January. The conversation lasted 38 minutes and ended with terms I had been working toward for most of the year. I confirmed the contract details in a follow-up email from the hotel lobby with the precision I bring to contract language, and then I got into my car and drove to my office. The weather that morning was the particular gray of late October, damp and still, not unpleasant. My office was warm. The screen on my desk was showing the architecture documentation for the new contract. I sat down and started working. People ask me sometimes, not about this specifically, because most of them don't know the specifics, but about patience, about the kind of patience that gets misread as passivity. And I tell them the same thing. Patience is not waiting. Waiting is what I did for 5 years. Passive, hope adjacent, full of deferred interpretation and careful management of a question I was afraid to have answered. Patience is what I did after. Patience is documenting everything you should have documented before. Patience is building the legal foundation while you are still in proximity. Patience is migrating the systems you control before anyone has understood that those systems are the floor of everything else. Patience is accepting an apology with one sentence and walking to your car to take the call you have been working toward for 6 months. The difference is this: waiting hands time to the other person. Patience keeps it. There's a version of this story where I am the man who gave too much and lost something he should have had, who didn't say the right thing at the right time, who waited and received nothing for it. I have sat with that version. I don't think it's accurate. What I would do differently: be more direct, earlier. Document my work from the first week. Ask the question in year 1 and take whatever answer came, rather than converting it into a reason to keep going. What would not be different? Who she was. What she wanted. The ceiling of what she was willing to offer against the floor of what I was providing. Some containers have a shape. No matter what you fill them with, they hold only what they hold. I was filling something that already had its arrangement made. I was the reliable, invisible layer, the thing that holds everything up without being counted among the load-bearing elements. She had not designed it that way deliberately, but she had not refused it either. When I removed myself, the building shook. When I built something of my own, I engineered it correctly from the first foundation stone. I do not think of her badly. I know this might sound like performance. It isn't. She ran a good business and built it well. She married a man who suited her in ways I had not, and I understood that even at the dinner, watching the way they occupied the same space, there was a naturalness to it I recognized as real. She was not dishonest. That's exactly. She was the beneficiary of something she had not properly valued, and she had not named it because naming it would have forced a choice she preferred to defer. That is a human thing to do. It cost me 5 years and a substantial amount of undocumented labor. What it gave me was the very specific clarity that comes from completing a long curriculum in exactly what not to repeat. I sleep differently now. Not better, exactly. Cleaner. Without the low-frequency hum of the unanswered question that I had been carrying for so long, I had stopped hearing it as a hum and started hearing it as silence. The actual silence, when it came, was different from that false silence, empty rather than suspended, still rather than held. I can work in it, I can build in it, I can think in it, I can tell the difference now. What's between something that has room in it and something that's already full? There was a morning in January, 2 weeks after incorporating the company, and 3 weeks after the dinner, and 1 week after Elena had confirmed all the documentation was clean and filed, when I woke before my alarm. I lay in the dark and felt something I could not precisely name, but which was the opposite of the weight I had been carrying. Not light, not free. Those words are too buoyant for what it was. More like correctly weighted. Like a scale adjusted to account for what it actually holds, rather than what it hoped to hold. I had 4 years of work, now documented. An IP transfer, completed and compensated. A company formed with the exact architecture I would have built years earlier if I had been paying attention to what I was actually building. It's a legal framework that was mine, entirely, without ambiguity or sentiment. I lay in the dark and thought, the next 5 years are mine. Then I got up, made coffee, started working. The Aldercroft Foundation has a dinner every December. I attended again this year, different table, different conversations. The room has the same smell, candle wax, cold white wine, the high-ceilinged sound of 300 people managing their proximity, the same careful arithmetic of who is standing next to whom and why. I did not look for her in the room, not because looking would have hurt me, because looking would have told me nothing I needed to know. What I needed to know, I had already gathered, organized, labeled, filed correctly, this time under the right category.